When war broke out, I was 7 years old. And I remember exactly where my parents and I were in a seaside, in a boarding house with all the family. It was a yearly retreat in the summer. And I remember the radio being put on. And I heard, because it was very hushed at the time, and I heard Neville Chamberlain, who was the Prime Minister of the day, returned from Germany, where he was supposed to make some sort of peace treaty with Hitler, and he had failed, and he actually said, "We are now at war with Germany." Right? The next thing, all the women were crying and everybody was worried of what to do. We had to get back to London. We lived in Hackney, which is East London. And nobody knew what to do. They didn't know what was going to happen, whether we would have planes sent over, and how would we live, and how would we shelter. Anyway, as it went on after a few weeks, people built what they called Anderson shelters. They were tin, and you dug a great big hole in the ground, and you put these tin wings up the walls and the top, and then covered it with grass and with turf to hide from, I suppose, the aeroplanes. And when the air raid warning started going off, everybody would run down to these little Anderson shelters, and people kept coffee and tea in them, and sugar and all sorts of other things that you needed in case you were there for a long time. And then you would all sort of pray that the bombs that they were dropping didn't drop on your house. And everybody was worried. And some of them lasted about an hour, 2 hours. And then gradually, when the siren, the all clear went, everybody would creep out of the Anderson shelters, and you could be there, and it was morning by the time you got out, and people gradually got back to their homes, or the unfortunate ones, when they came out, their home was razed to the ground. It had been bombed, and all their precious things, their home, their clothing, their livelihood, were just gone, just in a few hours. And then it was all the rubble, and people were brought out of the rubble, people were found in their houses. And it was a pretty nasty experience for a 7-year-old. But
so did the Blitz start right from the beginning of the war?
More or less, yes, within a couple of weeks. I mean, I was 7, so I'm not really sure about the actual
But
date.
it continued all the way through the war,
It continued all the way through until we got into Germany.
And people didn't always, if they didn't have their own shelters, did you ever do anything else?
Yes, as an alternative, if you lived near an underground station, people would all gather together in the underground, because that was pretty deep, and there was you couldn't see from the top. So they would all go to the underground, and we'd have a sing-along, and there'd be comedians down there, and everybody tried to rally round. People were very brave, very brave. There's not a lot you can do when you're facing life and death situations, and you have nothing to fight back with. You just turn to the Almighty, some people, or to each other. So you had a higher cause. You were worried for your life. You don't know what was going to happen when you came out of the shelters and the underground. But people were very together then. There was no discrimination. Everybody was just worried for their lives and their families. After about, must have been not very long, a couple of months, my parents and my father's brother and his family they hired a huge, like a lorry, it was a pantechnicon that they called in those days, and my parents' furniture from their house was all packed in, and other bits of furniture, and there were 3 families in this huge lorry. And they went down to a place called Maidenhead, where in the First World War, my grandfather had taken his family, although there wasn't the overhead aircraft that we were suffering from. And we found a house, and we all lived in that house. And the funny thing is, we stayed overnight somewhere in a little village just outside Maidenhead, because my uncle and my father were too tired to drive anymore. And we had found this little bungalow where there were 3 families in this little bungalow, and we had always lived in the city, so we had never seen the early morning mist. And one of the ladies was a foreign lady, one of the grandmothers, and she went to the bathroom and looked out the window, and she saw this mist, and she started screaming. She was saying in her foreign tongue, "We're being gassed, we're being gassed." And we all woke up.
Like it was...
Yes,
Yeah.
So...
Basically a bit of morning fog.
It was a morning fog, but in that time of the year you would get a mist in the morning. It wasn't thick fog like you experienced in town. It was like a fine... It was sort of hanging around in the air, this mist. Anyway, my father came down, and at that time we were all given gas masks, because we thought we were going to have gas bombs or whatever they were.
You remember the gas masks, like the ones in the Doctor Who thing, with the tube that came down?
Yeah, we all had those in little sort of cardboard boxes. You came out and you had to put them out. So everybody, all the family, walking around in the little cottage there, were walking around in gas masks. And my father, who was the brave one, he said, "Well, I'm going out." He said, "I can't believe it. There's been no warning. No police haven't come down the road saying that it's gas, what have you." He looked out the window. It was all quiet. So he ventured out into the front garden. And my mother, I remember, was holding on to his overcoat, saying, "Don't be a hero." She would say, "Don't be a hero and go out, And my father said, "It's impossible." He said, "I've driven around all over London and outside London for work." And he said, I can't believe it. Anyway, he went out and we all watched through these little windows to see what would happen to my father. And we saw him take off the gas mask, and my mother started really weeping really loudly. "What's he doing? What's he doing?" Anyway, he finally walked up to the front door and he said, "We behaved like idiots, all of us. It's the country, and it's just the early morning mist." He said, "It smells beautiful out there. It's definitely not being gassed." Anyway, we made such a noise that the residents of this little village got together and signed petitions to get us out of this little cottage, because we made such a noise and a disturbance that it disturbed the whole village. So we had to leave. And eventually we settled in Maidenhead, where I was brought up, and I lived till I was 21 before we came back to London. But my brother, who was 17 at the time, volunteered to go into the army. My father was very upset because he didn't have to join till he was 18, but he felt he was idealistic, and he went into the army I think he was about 17 and a half. Into the Royal Engineers, and he went right through the war. In fact, we had a little hiccup because on D-Day he was in the Royal Engineers, as I said. When the soldiers went out, with my brother was in this open-air sort of tank thing that floated over, and it was pulled by a boat with an engine, and it just sort of floated on behind, and the rope broke of my brothers, and they floated back to England. They were very lucky because there were a lot of mines in the water, landmines and sea mines, and a lot of his friends were blown up in front of his eyes, and it was a terrible experience. But they got back, and my parents had a telegram to say that my brother was missing, which meant he'd probably died. And of course you can understand how sad and how terrible it was. But about 48 hours later, we had a phone call from my brother to say that he had landed safely. He was missing for the time. They couldn't account for him. And they let him come home on a day's leave. So he came home on that leave, but then he had to return. And at that time, when they first landed, I think the Germans were more or less waiting for them, weren't they? And they were all prepared with their guns and with the heavy armament,
big tanks. They had big cannons, all aiming at the sea.
Yes. And as the soldiers were coming off onto the sand on the beaches, they were being knocked down like flies. And so everybody that owned a boat in England, they all got together and they went over and brought back the wounded soldiers so that they could get them off the beaches so that, some of them could be saved. Where was I? So he came back and then he went back into the war, and he stayed in the war till he was nearly 25. A long time. He came back a different person. He was a guitarist. He had very long, thin fingers, and he was a wonderful Spanish guitarist. He played the Hawaiian guitar, jazz, played everything. He was offered a place in a band, Geraldo, which was a very famous orchestra at that time. But he said he'd had enough of travelling around, he wanted to be in a stable home. And he also was very ill for a couple of years because they used to lay these pontoon bridges which floated on top of the water.
So the tanks could get across, when they
didn't need any
foundations.
Yes, any structure to build a bridge, but they just floated on the water, so as Marshall said, so the tanks could get across the sea. And he developed pleurisy, and he was really very, very ill. It took a couple of years before he recovered. And it takes it out. Like the young men coming back from Afghanistan today, they feel guilty that friends, and he had 2 or 3 very close friends. One was a Scottish boy. He was lovely. He used to come to our house when my brother was on leave with him. And he blew up in front of his eyes. He stepped on a mine and he blew up. And things like that to a very sensitive boy. It remains in your mind forever. I can't imagine what it was like to be in that with the bullets going past you and thinking you're the next one that's going to get a bullet. So that's all I remembered, and then we stayed in Maidenhead until the war was over, and then we came back to London. But that was my war. That's how it affected me, because everybody's got a different story. Other children's fathers went in to the army. My father was too old, fortunately for us. But he used to have to go to work from Maidenhead into London, and my mother was always worried that he would, the building that he worked in would get bombed. And so we lived very hazardous, mentally hazardous lives. And but people were very friendly. People were like family should be. They were there for one another, strangers. And especially we were Jewish at the time. We were Jewish, and coming into a place like Maidenhead, people didn't know anything about Jewish people because we mostly lived in London, Jewish people. Very few people ventured out of London. And I was the only Jewish girl in the school.
And you're the tallest.
I'm the tallest, yes. And I remember when I first went to school, there were several children there that used to run around after me in the playground. I was about 8 at that time. And they used to say, "Oh, she's got horns. she's got horns, and I used to get so upset because I'd never heard that I had horns. I used to run home, at the end of the day to my parents, and I'd cry. I'd say, "You didn't tell me I had horns. I had horns."
As it was bad enough that Hitler started exterminating the Jews.
Yes.
Your own country.
Yes. I was very tired. Anyway, my father went to see Mr. Rippon, the headmaster, who became very great friends with my father, and he spoke to the assembly in the school. And he explained what was going on outside Maidenhead and outside England. And after that, the children were much more friendly. And in fact, I ended up being head girl of the junior school. So I really enjoyed that. Well, I was only 11, 12 or something.
So do you think that's?
Is that all right?
Yeah.
Yes.